AG, it's Richard Edelman, and we're here to discuss trust and journalism. You just gave a very profound speech at the Kellogg Institute about misinformation, polarization, etc. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what gave you the idea and what you were trying to convey?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you for having me. It's great to see you again. So the speech I gave was actually built on a piece I wrote in the Washington Post a few months before the election, and basically the piece in the Washington Post was looking at how the free press has been effectively dismantled in eroding democracies around the world. And it basically was an encouragement for our colleagues across the rest of the media landscape to really start to understand what happened and how significant and sustained this campaign, and to understand the levers that have been used, because they're quite consistent across countries as diverse as Hungary and India and Brazil, and it was clear that the Trump team was studying that campaign and was very explicit in its intention to adopt some of those tactics and to import them here to go after the American press. And so the Post piece was basically get to know this because we may face some of these tactics here. And one of the points I make in there, and I suspect it's of interest to you because of your interest in trust, is that this is happening in a landscape in which the press is vulnerable because of a long-standing erosion of societal trust in all institutions, very much including the media, and because of a sustained campaign very specifically to sow distrust in media, right? We all know terms like fake news, enemy of the people. And so that's, that was the broader point I was trying to highlight, and really trying to highlight like why, regardless of your politics, you're conservative, moderate, liberal, why the free press is so essential in our society, and why it was one of the few points of consensus among the very diverse founding fathers of our nation, and one of the few points of consensus, regardless of ideological line, for much of the last century in Congress, in the Supreme Court, in the presidency. So it is a very challenging moment, and there are a number of distinct pressures that I think the American press is facing.
We have absolutely tracked a downward progression for three of the institutions: the media, NGOs, and government. The one that's rallied is business. Business had a very good COVID. Business is suddenly the most trusted. It's seen as the most competent and the most ethical, which is quite shocking. And one of the findings in last year's study is this descent into grievance, that people feel the system doesn't work, that they have no voice, that they, in fact, young people, Gen Z, 50% justify hostile activism.
Yeah.
Do you think that's partly a function of misinformation and the way in which they just have a distorted mirror?
Look, I think there's a few things going on there, right? And as it regards the press, right, I actually think there's a few critical roles that the press plays that I think play essential roles in addressing some of the unique dynamics that have made our information ecosystem increasingly dysfunctional. Set aside politics for a second, right? Even set aside policy for a second, right? The broader dysfunctions of the internet, misinformation, a sense that shared reality is eroding, polarization and tribalism, right? A sense that everyone is cleaving into teams, right? And have very little tolerance for people not on their teams. A growing culture of inequality and impunity, right? And I spent some time staring at those challenges, and I was just shocked to see how almost perfectly the mission of an institution like the Times, an independent news organization, maps to it. So what is the most effective solution to misinformation, to propaganda, to just sort of the lazy punditry that has overwhelmed the information ecosystem? it's truth. It's truth finding, right? Those are the building blocks of building a shared reality. What's the antidote to polarization, tribalism? It's understanding. This is a diverse and divided nation. There's no doubt about it. And the thing that we need to come together in common purpose is understanding and empathy, right? And a big part of the job of journalists is to shine a light on people with different views than you, with different experiences from you. And then, what's the antidote to a culture of, growing inequality and impunity? Well, the big conceit behind the free press, why it's long been viewed as such an essential ingredient in democracy, is that we ask the tough questions of people in power on behalf of the public. And we do the very difficult, sometimes unpopular work of bringing to the public information that sometimes powers want to keep secret. I think this is a moment in which the sort of central role of journalism has become, more important than ever in all sorts of ways, from the sort of very functional, right, to like information, truth, facts, to the softer, right, empathy, understanding, to the harder stuff that's more often celebrated in, movies, like All the President's Men, right? I should say one other thing, that your research always reminds me. I do think that the term media is really unhelpful, right? It is such a broad, sweeping term. I bet if I asked you whether you trusted the media, if you asked me whether I trusted the media, I'm not sure I'd say yes, right? And the reason I wouldn't say yes is, are you talking about social media, right? The sort of largest, most systemic purveyors of, disinformation and division that we've ever seen? Are we talking about cable news, in which, often consists of, two partisan pundits, yelling their talking points at each other without doing any listening or actual understanding? Or are we talking about the type of journalism that I've just talked about, which is reporting, right? Which is being out in the world, really seeking to deeply understand and inhabit the stories that you are covering and the lives that you are trying to bring to readers.
So what we've seen is a decline in trust in leaders. So whether it's CEOs, government leaders, and now journalists, 70% in the most recent Trust Barometer said we think journalists intentionally lie to us for clicks or for their own ends or whatever, along with the other leaders. And so do you think somehow that this trend towards podcasting and sort of smaller groups going towards particular individuals gives them more trust because it's not an institution, it's a person?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a question that I think a lot of people are asking in this moment. It was interesting to see it as a theme in your research. I have sort of a contrarian view on this. One of the mistakes I think that many organizations, including news organizations, have made in the 11 years that I've been leading digital transformation is taking a new trend and then imagining it riding all the way, right? So print is dead, now it's digital. Desktop is dead, now it's mobile. Search is dead, now it's social, right? The written word is dead, reading is dead, now it's podcasts, it's video, right? We've just seen version after version of that. And one of the versions that we've heard that whole time has been authority is dead, it's now authenticity, which is another way of saying a shift from institutions to individuals. And I've seen again and again, competitors sort of bet the farm on the next thing, and we never see the next thing win out. We see the ecosystem just growing more complex, right? So print, desktop, search, these are all really important parts of our business, of how we reach readers. And similarly, I think this question about authenticity versus authority is like just a false dichotomy, right? I think that there is a lot of evidence that that brands still matter, that institutions still matter. The word I would use is that newsrooms still matter. We can just do work that no one else can do, right? No one else can give reporters 5 years to systematically uncover the reality of America's drone program and then trigger reform, right? Like, you can't do that from a podcast. You can't do that from a newsletter. You're not seeing that happening from this new emerging ecosystem. And so the way I think about it, is those folks who are coming up with newsletters and podcasts, they are transforming a long-standing role in our media ecosystem, which is the role of the pundit, of the commentator, right, of the analyst, right? What they are not doing is replacing the role of the reporter. And in fact, they still depend on the role of the reporter, because what is it that they are commenting on and arguing about? It's often the work that reporters at the New York Times and our like-minded competitors are uncovering.
But what's interesting about that line of thinking is the combination of reporting with editorial or opinion, and theirs is largely opinion. Yours is largely editorial, reporting.
Yeah.
And you have a quite clear distinction.
Yeah.
You have an op-ed, and then you have reporting.
Yeah.
But the trend is towards
commentary. Yeah, it really is. And I think that is the most underexamined shift in the media ecosystem by far, right? So everyone, in my profession knows the stat that we have hemorrhaged journalism jobs in this country so fast that it has actually been at larger in absolute numbers in the last couple of decades and in percentage terms than coal miners, right? So, not exactly a profession synonymous with the future, right? So, we all know the sort of absolute decline in media jobs and journalism jobs. But underneath the surface of that trend, I think we've seen an equally worrying trend, which is when you were growing up, when I was growing up, 90% of your journalism calories, 80%, 90%, were being delivered by reporters, right? Most of the journalism jobs in this country were reporting jobs, mostly at the local level. And today, I think we've seen an almost complete inversion. Today, I would guess that 5 to 10% of every journalism job in this country is a reporting job. Most are commentary, punditry, hot takes on one side, or aggregation on the other. And the reason for that is because reporting is so expensive. It's so expensive, right? And it's uncertain work, right? Like, you could report on the story for a month, and then the most responsible thing to do is to deliver nothing because the story didn't pan out. Most journalism jobs need to be delivering, a story a day, 3 newsletters a week, some places 5 stories a day, 2 podcasts a week, right? Like, that type of output is just contrary to the sort of original reporting and on the ground reporting that is done. So that trend, I think, is exactly right. We've seen this inversion. And, I think of reporting, the fact gathering, of the gathering and dissemination of facts into the information ecosystem. I think of it as like the plankton of the ocean, right? Which is every organism in the ocean in some way benefits from that, right? From like the smallest coral, right? Or oyster, to the largest blue whale, right? And that's what we're losing. And we now see as a society what happens when you lose that, right? When you start to lose that, you start to have an information ecosystem that becomes unmoored from fact and reality, and becomes divided by ideology and preference and tribal allegiance.
So do you also see a trend towards short form and vertical? In other words, if you look at Axios, and they're quite serious success, theirs is, I can read this Mike Allen newsletter in whatever 5 minutes or 3 minutes, as opposed to the Times, which takes, if you're really into it, it could take an hour or whatever. So it's short form. Then the other is verticals. So they have Axios Tech or Axios like this, and of course you have your own sections. You have a business section, etc. But is it becoming even more subdivided?
Yeah, so I mean, form is such an interesting thing. And I think our answer on form has basically been all of the above, right? So, when I began leading the digital transformation work, right, in the newsroom, we really thought that we could just produce the best work and then the world would come to us, right? And we had forgotten one of the great lessons of the newspaper era, which is we never thought we could just produce the best work and the world would come to us. We worked so hard to make sure that people saw it that we built a factory, we printed it on paper, we loaded it onto trucks, we drove it to towns, we gave it to kids on bikes, and the kids on bikes dropped it off on your doorstep every morning, right? And that degree of commitment to making sure that the work is actually seen was something we hadn't translated to the digital age. And so a big part of what we've been trying to do has basically been to, find the modern playbook for that. And that includes experimenting with formats. So it used to be we published the big investigation, the big 6,000-word investigation that maybe you read every word of and devour it, or maybe you're someone who just doesn't have the time today, or maybe it feels like too daunting a task to take on. So we would publish it, and then everyone else would aggregate it and write the short form piece about it, right? Here's the main takeaways of the New York Times big investigation. Today, we are aggregating ourselves. So we are publishing it simultaneously with 5 takeaways, very short form, sort of a listy, easy to consume way. But we're also now publishing it with a vertical video, right? Direct to camera, a reporter just saying, here's who I am, here's why I picked this target, here's the work I did, right? You talk about trust building, it's just this degree of candor and transparency around process. And here's what I found, and here's why you should believe it, and here's why it matters. And then we put it into our newsletter. So we have the most read newsletter in America. We have the most listened to news podcast in America. So that same investigation will go to those places too. And all of these are different ways to reach different groups who may prefer to listen to the news or watch the news, or want it short and tight, or, a large number of our readers want to digest every detail, which is part of what makes our work so impactful.
Do you feel, as a matter of marketing or audience, that you need to be in some way ideologically defined, or do you rebel against that idea?
Just to quote my great-great-grandfather, right? His first promise to the readers of the New York Times was that we would report without fear of favor, regardless of party, interest, or sect, right? So, so we, believe we need to be, completely independent from all those forces, and I've had many people say, well, God, doesn't that seem like that's destined for failure? Aren't you betting against the market? This is a tribal moment. Social media has basically been designed to organize us in these tribal sectarian ways, right? By things like party or identity, right? Or interest or passion, right? I feel very strongly that the most underserved person in the modern information ecosystem is the person who wants the whole story, is the person who's not afraid to hear the perspective that they disagree with, right? Maybe because it gets them to think differently, maybe just because it makes their own arguments better. But, the person who's just curious. And one of the things that I'm always so charmed by is one of the things that distinguishes New York Times readers, right? Far more than, income or ideology or identity or geography, right? Our fastest growing regions of readership and subscribers is the Midwest and the South, right? So there's like, and rural communities have been growing fast. What distinguishes them more than any of those things is curiosity, a willingness to be challenged. And so there's this very charming thing. People's favorite columnist at the Times often is the one they disagree with most. And I just love that about. To me, that's a really optimistic statement in this divided moment in our country. Yeah.
So one of the things we've found in the trust research is that trust is local. Trust is in my employer. Now we find that trust is in aspects to do with me as opposed to we. That our study that we're releasing today is all about brands and needing to move away from sort of societal benefits to personal benefits, because people are really nervous about the job effects of AI or inflation or all the other things that you know. At the same time, you've got a real decline in local newspapers, which of course you are well aware of. I mean, I grew up in Chicago. The Tribune was a fine paper. It's now winnowed to, I don't know, under 100 people in the newsroom. Quite shocking. So if you have news deserts, how do you fill this void for the country?
I mean, I think you're pointing to exactly the right problem, right? Local journalism accounted for the vast majority of journalism jobs in this country and has been particularly hard hit. National media is not resting on solid ground by any means, right? It still faces its challenge, but it got to a point of stability where it stopped declining, and some places, like the Times, are even growing again. We've doubled the number of journalists at the New York Times in the last couple of years, in the last decade. Local continues an unmitigated decline that I think is a national tragedy and I think represents a real danger to our nation. There's been all this research that shows that when local media erodes, you start to see declines in civic bonds, in trust, you see rises in corruption, right, and misconduct, and you just see a withering of a sense of identity and community, and those things really matter. So I think what I want to see is our nation start to care about informed communities the way that we care about educated communities, right? Because there's not a community in America that doesn't care about its schools, right, or its colleges, right? And there's a huge amount of money that pour into those institutions because we want educated communities. But democracy depends on informed communities too, right? Self-governance requires understanding. And so I think as a society, we are going to need to find a scalable solution to this crisis.
Yeah. So one other finding that stuns us every year in the Trust Barometer is that the most credible source of information is a company newsletter because it's seen somehow as objective, meaning it's boring, that's for sure, but it doesn't seem to take a side. And it's not reporting, it's just relating or something like this. For example, during COVID, people felt, the newsletter from American Express told me that this COVID vaccine was okay to take, so I'm going to do it. Is there any role for that, do you see, or is it just filling a void? Or,
candidly, I worry about that model, and I think society should worry about that model. I could tell you all day how smart and wonderful I am or my institution is. But if I were you, I would trust the great reporters at the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post and the New Yorker and the Atlantic and Axios and others to answer that question, right? And because it is not in the interests of institutions or powerful people to share information that they don't want public. It is in their interest to spin their story.
So one other development that's quite clear is that the tech industry increasingly is going towards podcasts to do their interviews as opposed to what my father used to describe as the ordeal of media, which is the necessity that he always felt you have to, communicate that way. But there's another path now. And people talk for 3 or 4 hours, and,
it's amazing.
it passes as the ordeal of media. It's quite different.
We've seen versions of this, right? We're both old enough to remember the blog era, right? In which that was the new way, right? So disintermediate, the gatekeepers in media and just talk directly, and using many, many words. And then we got the newsletter era, right? Hear directly from me in your inbox. And now we're at the podcast era. I think social video is going to be, another version of that for different uses, maybe a different generation. And all that stuff has value. Like, I listen to a bunch of podcasts like this, and find that long form, sort of unmediated ability to really get in the mind of someone and to understand the complexity and the nuance. I find all that really valuable. I find it valuable in an additive way to what I'm describing as the sort of core of reporting, of having folks on the ground. We won 2 Pulitzer Prizes this year for reporting that just other institutions weren't doing because it was too expensive, it was too dangerous. And as a result, those stories weren't being told. We had a team of 3 journalists, and actually and a couple of photographers, so a larger group than that, on the ground for the full year in Afghanistan, making sure that America learned the lessons of its longest war, right? A war that is broadly seen as having failed, right? The Taliban is once again in power. And can you imagine a world in which no American journalists went back to ask the questions, what went wrong? And to make sure that the people of Afghanistan, the people we were ostensibly fighting for 2 decades, weren't forgotten by the American public. Similarly, we went to Sudan, which is now the bloodiest conflict on earth. And we went to places that no Western journalists, not just American journalists, no Western journalists had gone throughout the duration of the conflict. So again, at great personal risk, these folks went there just to make sure that society has that story. And then let's argue about it over podcasts, right? Let's learn those lessons and debate them and discuss them. But that foundational thing, reporting, and independent reporting specifically, that's the thing I believe I'm going to spend my career fighting for.
So do you find your young journalists in a sort of different cultural mode? For example, rejecting editors. Like, I was on the street during the George Floyd riots. I know what happened here. And then going back, and the editor said, this should be the first paragraph, and then just pushing back. I just reflect this from my own workplace.
Look, there isn't a workplace in America that hasn't felt the sort of cultural tumult of the era, right? And I don't think it was just Floyd. I think there was like a cascade of things, and culture just felt like it was changing, and the most significant, changing very rapidly. The most significant of all those things, I think, actually was COVID, right? Like the isolation of that era, right? And in some ways, that was the moment in which every institution began to take on some of the characteristics of the internet, right? With its divisions and, the rancor, right? We've worked really hard. We don't treat culture as an afterthought at the Times, and I don't think we ever have, but particularly as we started to recognize some of the trends that you're describing, we have just doubled and tripled down on the importance of having our own culture, a distinct culture that we establish. And so we are much more explicit when we hire, when we bring people into our ecosystem, when we give feedback about, sort of our unique expectations. And the most important, one that I relay, right, is we're an independent news organization. And that means that you are going to find some voice in our pages every day that you disagree with, including on issues that you really care about, right? And that's because we're quoting a diversity of views in our news pages. And on our opinion pages, we are running people with a diversity of views from left to right. And so if you care deeply about an issue as divisive as, say, abortion, you are going to find perspectives you disagree every single day in the New York Times, regardless of what side you're on. If you don't like that, if you view that as a weakness in our model, you're going to hate it here. And you shouldn't be at the New York Times, right? We're going to drive you crazy because we're never going to change. But if you view that as a strength, if you view that as this institution reflecting this foundational commitment to a diverse and pluralistic democracy, and providing the service of understanding, of mutual understanding that we view as foundational to the success of a healthy society, then this is a really exciting workplace for you to be a part of.
So one final question. We're at Cannes, which is really the center of marketing innovation, and we're releasing this study today about trust and brands, and our basic theory is silence is not an option, and that brands are actually more trusted than any institution, more than government, more than business, et cetera, because somehow they're seen as providing me optimism, hope, security, and I also can be in control of that relationship. If I don't like what the brands are doing in terms of employment or sourcing or anything, I don't have to buy it. I can buy another brand. And so the New York Times is a special brand. How do you see your role? Leave aside the media, the role of the Times as a brand.
Well, first and foremost, we want to be synonymous with independent journalism that reports deeply on the world without fear of favor, right? We just think that is the most important thing that we do. You know, my family has, worked to steward this enterprise for more than 130 years now, and that commitment is explicitly built into, our family mission. I think we're playing a really important journalistic role, particularly at a moment when institutions are being questioned with good reason, right, from across the political spectrum, and when democratic norms are being challenged directly, right? I think that that's a moment in which journalism, is especially critical. I also am really proud that we have continued to expand what the New York Times stands for, right? So, yes, we've got the best collection of reporting talent in the world on hard news. We've significantly expanded Washington. We've significantly expanded our investigative reporting ranks. But we now actually have the largest team of sports journalists in the English language, which is remarkable, right? And that's The Athletic, which provides, I think something like 200 sports stories a day. So it's, if you are a passionate fan, we are serving you in that way. Our games product, Wordle and Connections, and some really exciting games still to come. Our cooking product, Wirecutter, which does best-in-class consumer research, product research, to help consumers decide what's worth their money, and does it in the most ethical and transparent way. So we continue to expand that value proposition, and I think that that's really important in a moment in which some people aren't engaging with the news because it provides an on-ramp for people to start to begin a relationship with the New York Times, a place that's synonymous with the news, but it also provides some degree of relief from the news, right? There's hard stuff on our pages every single day. And, I don't think this is a time to tune out, to avert your eyes from that. But if after engaging with that for a while and you're just feeling a little overwhelmed, I don't blame you for opening Wordle and just trying to solve a 6-letter word in 5 guesses. I think that's part of how we're trying to meet this moment.
Great. Well, AJ, thank you for what you do, and thank you for being a leader, because that's what we need at the moment. We need people to stand up and speak up. And
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me, and I'm very excited to see the research that you've been citing. I'll read it with deep interest.
okay, thanks.
All right, take care.